Welcome to Apex Magazine. Strange, surreal, shocking, beautiful. This is the Apex Magazine podcast. I'm your host and producer, Allie Nesbitt. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into this brand new episode. This month, we have a harrowing and thoughtful lycanthropic tale from Codì Audeguy-Pegon, read for you by the enigmatic Gabe Hicks. Before we can get to the story, though, we have just a few announcements. Join Apex Book Company for our ongoing Kickstarter project, Robotic Ambitions, an anthology of robotic sentience. Edited by Jason Sizemore and Leslie Connor, Robotic Ambitions will be completed by stories from our upcoming open submissions call. Whether striving to protect the family they've chosen, searching for meaning amidst the chaos of the world, or questioning what it is that makes one alive, robotic ambitions can mean many different things. From robots and AI to sentient mechanical devices, this anthology will explore what it means to be sentient and mechanical. Get all the details about the Kickstarter and our submissions call at apex-magazine.com/blog/robotic-ambitions-kickstarter-launch. If you are enjoying what we have to offer on this podcast, we cordially invite you to become an Apex Magazine Patreon supporter. For as little as $2 a month, you'll gain early access to our monthly microfiction themes and an archive of past author interviews and other insights. Visit patreon.com/apexbookcompany for more information. And now, let us turn our attention to this month's story. Apex Magazine proudly presents Episode 99, Over Moonlit Clouds by Codì Audeguy-Pegon.
Folks later claimed she was acting strange from the moment she boarded the plane. They described her as skittish, curt, radiating an aura of danger. Some, when confronted with the security footage, which showed her to have behaved rather unremarkably up until she bolted to the bathroom, refused to change their story. They swore 9 ways till Sunday that they saw what they saw, that CCTV lenses simply failed to capture the malevolent glint they'd caught in her eyes. I noticed no such thing. To me, she was just another passenger, another hand presenting a ticket stub, a faceless body to be directed down the appropriate aisle. Later, when I was walking down the cabin to make sure all seatbelts were securely fastened, I did notice an edge to her polite smile, but it struck me as more frazzled than threatening. Just another nervous flyer. During the multitude of protracted inquiries and trials that followed the incident, she never changed her position. She admitted, without caveat, that she'd made a foolish mistake. The masses, however, demanded a more compelling story, something on which to project their fear, a culprit more substantial than a mere fumble. Her defenders insisted on painting her as a victim of environmental pressures. She was battling the state for custody of her 3 children, and her employers were in the midst of a massive retrenchment campaign, and her building was going co-op, and her widowed mother had recently passed and left her with massive medical bills, and she was having to travel back and forth to manage all the various crises. And the system failed her, they claimed. Some went as far as to blame the airline. How, they asked, could we have allowed this to happen? People like her have existed since the dawn of history. How could we have been so unprepared? It's sad to think that last step may have caused her ultimate undoing. The moment corporate profits were in jeopardy, the debate got ugly. Some big law firm with too many old money names on the letterhead got involved, and they had no qualms stoking prejudice to redirect blame. In the eyes of the public, they made her into a monster. The first clear memory I have of her is one of beautiful weariness. The last rays of the setting sun were dancing on the ridges and valleys of her features, highlighting her capable but rushed faux naturel makeup. She looked exhausted, but oddly wistful as she stared out the window, her body slumped in the stiff seat, her attention lost in the vast stretch of clouds. She turned to me, cheeks twitching into a reflexive smile. "Excuse me?" she asked, blinking in confusion. "Would you like something to drink?" I repeated. She checked the cart in front of me. "Oh, no, thank you." I made to move on to the next passenger. The practice script already playing out in my head, the words howled out of meaning by countless repetition, already forming on my tongue when she jerked upright. The sudden motion caught my attention, drawing me back to her face, only to see it solidify into a mask of pure dread. Her jaw dropped, nostrils flaring, terror shimmering in her wide-open eyes. Oh no. Barely a whisper, the two syllables tumbling out of trembling lips. She leapt out of her seat. One moment she was sitting there, her stance comfortably familiar, and the next her knees were to her chest and she was propelling herself in the air with the grace of a wild animal. I ducked. She hit the drink cart. Some of the bottles and cartons toppled, the spills producing a burst of startled yelps. I felt her vault over me as I dropped to the floor. She landed with a thud. By the time I looked over my shoulder, she was already racing to the bathroom at the tail of the plane, shooting past confused faces without a backwards glance. She tried the stall on the left, found it locked. She let out a distressed moan before crashing against the right stall. The door gave way and she disappeared, slamming the lock in place. Murmurs filled the cabin. I felt the weight of countless gazes as I straightened. My brain registered a grumbled complaint, and the hardwired reflexes of a service job snapped me out of my shock. I grabbed a handful of napkins and offered them rather helplessly to the pair of passengers who'd just been doused in fruit juice and milk. "I'm so very sorry," I professed as I straightened the toppled bottles and cartons. "I'll get a bigger cloth." Those questioning gazes followed me as I made my way down the aisle. Ayanda and Sam caught up with me by the bathroom, wanting to know what happened. I'd worked shifts with them before, and I knew that if I indulged their curiosity, they'd get distracted. What they needed were clear instructions, a task to keep them out of the way. I sent Sam to address the spill and asked Ayanda to find Nasim, our crew leader. I gently knocked on the bathroom door. "Are you all right?" When I didn't get an answer, I listened closer. She was clearly doing her best to stifle the sound, but there was no mistaking it. She was sobbing. "Please, tell me how we can help."
"You have to."
Her voice cracked. Each word was a struggle, but she was so desperate to get them out.
"You have to land the plane."
At that point, I probably should have been worried, but I still saw her as an uncomfortable flyer, a particularly dramatic one, to be sure, but I simply couldn't imagine such a ludicrous request was coming from a reasonable place. "We can't help you unless you tell us what's wrong."
I'm so sorry.
She hiccuped.
I lost count of the days.
The last words turned into a soft whine. I'm not sure what it was about her voice. Maybe how genuine and visceral her dismay felt, even through the locked door. But it jogged something in my memory. The connection wasn't fully formed yet, more like a faint tugging at the back of my mind. Before I could get a firm grasp on it, Ayanda returned with Nasim. I delivered my report, sticking to the facts, which made for a short list. "She lost count of the days?" Nasim repeated. I shrugged. Now that a supervisor was on the scene, I was only too glad to take a sheepish step back. Nasim knocked on the door. "Ma'am, are you in need of medical help?" We strained our ears, hoping to catch a response. All we heard was a faint, raspy breathing. We jumped when the door to the toilet stall behind us swung open, but made a quick recovery. The passenger frowned at our plastered smiles. "Please," Nasim recited without missing a beat. "Could we ask you to return to your seat?" The passenger's confusion only increased upon sensing the sickly sweet density of fresh drama permeating the cabin. Then came the moan. It was an otherworldly sound, a snarl biting down on a whimper. Instead of reacting, Nassim punctuated the polite instruction with a graceful, if insistent, wave down the aisle. Our smiles never faltered, as though none of us could hear the inarticulate groans coming from the locked stall. Cowed by our lack of shock, the passenger had no choice but to obey. Nassim leaned towards Ayanda and whispered, "Go help Sam keep the herd in check." I never much liked that sort of dehumanizing language when referring to our guests, but as I followed Ayanda with my gaze, the wording did feel appropriate. The herd was definitely getting restless. An economy class cabin is a powder keg of tension on the best of days, a myriad of mild annoyances crammed into a flying steel tube. In such an atmosphere, mysteries are best avoided. Nassim gave another rap on the still-locked bathroom door. "Ma'am, we need to know what's going on." Nothing. The strange moaning had stopped. "Ma'am." The door unlocked. We both took a step back. She only opened the door a sliver before tossing something at our feet, then slamming the door back shut, lock and all. I bent down to pick up a small medical bracelet. Again, memory tugged at the back of my mind. I flipped it over, unaware that my life was about to change forever, and found a small tag branded with 3 simple letters. LYC. The same panic I had read in her eyes filled my chest, and the same helpless words floated out of my mouth. Oh no. My aunt's husband was diagnosed with lycanthropy as an infant. He was one of the lucky ones, especially back then. Many in his situation were murdered during episodes, attacked on sight, all too often by a loved one or relative. Some simply ran off into the night, reappearing weeks, months, sometimes years later, as nameless corpses in a ditch. Most kept their condition a secret as they strived for normal lives, shouldering the burden alone for as long as they could. Strange condition, lycanthropy. The overwhelming instinct among those afflicted is to hide it, even as toddlers, to cower in fear and silence until the moon passes. It is as though they know, even then, how catastrophically a bad encounter can go. That's all most folks know, the bad encounters. Tragic affairs. Gaping bullet wounds from a rifle wielded in panic, flesh torn open by teeth in bare hands, buckets of blood spilled in misinformed self-defense. My uncle was one of the loveliest men I've ever known. He wasn't without his flaws, but he brought a touch of tenderness to everything he did. Every task, every word, every smile. I think it was his way of tipping the balance, of making up for his behavior during episodes. I found out about his condition when I was around 5. I asked my parents why he and my aunt didn't have any children, and they explained it rather poorly, framing his condition as inherently dangerous, especially to a child. I was afraid of him for years. The messed up part is that he might have agreed with their description. I never had the courage to ask him directly, so I can't know for sure. I did eventually ask my aunt, though. By then, I'd realized my parents could be wrong about a great many things, and I wanted to make up my own mind. And again, the man was a sweetheart. I simply couldn't imagine him as dangerous. My aunt did a better job of explaining it. Once a month, she told me, he had a bad night. They knew about it. They were prepared for it. And they made it through moon after moon. She explained that yes, the decision not to have children was about protecting a potential offspring, but not at all in the way my parents told it. My uncle simply couldn't bear to pass down his affliction to a child. I ended up doing a whole bunch of research on my own, and his concern did have some basis. The condition is very much hereditary. We know this. Thing is, though, the mutation actually lies dormant in roughly half the cases, sometimes for generations. Nowadays, with the right prenatal medication, the odds of genetic transference are less than 1 in 300. That's nothing. I like to believe they might have given it a shot had they had access to those treatments back then. Not that it matters. Those two seemed at peace with their lot. And I, for one, found their devotion to each other, free of any procreational rationale, rather inspiring. He did try lycosuppressants when they became widely available to alleviate the symptoms of his episodes. He and my aunt agreed it did wonders for his dispositions under a full moon. Docile as a pup, they joked. But I found the treatment soured him the rest of the time. He became brooding, withdrawn, his infectious laughter replaced by tired chuckles. I'm sure the right cocktail of suppressants would have balanced out the side effects, but his doctor wasn't really that committed to a solution. Past a certain age, cases become less interesting. Too bogged down in old habits to provide an easy and cathartic breakthrough. I managed to convince them to let me stay over a few times, just to see it for myself. Mostly, I made tea, keeping my aunt hydrated while she read out loud from his favorite books. I watched as my funny, gentle, loving uncle cowered at the end of the sofa, curled up in a trembling ball. He was barely in his 60s, with plenty of good years still ahead of him when he died. He was having a particularly bad moon. My aunt wasn't up to it alone, and nobody was there to help. She was sobbing when she called me. I'm the one who convinced her to call emergency services. I got there as fast as I could. The police officers insisted they were only trying to subdue him. His heart gave out sometime between the third and fourth taser shot. His funeral was well attended. I met folks from his support group there. They all had the same quality that I love so much in him, that deliberate gentleness, that mischievous softness in their eyes. Months later, I was clearing space off my phone when I stumbled on an app I'd installed to keep track of the moon's phases. I like to call them after each full moon, see how they were holding up. I was still in touch with my aunt, but keeping count of the days was no longer relevant. I almost uninstalled the app, but sentimentality stayed my hand. I figured if I was thinking about him, I could check how the moon was doing, see what kind of day he'd be having if he were still alive. This romantic fantasy never materialized. The next time I opened the app was on that plane, outside a locked bathroom stall. Nassim blinked, eyes darting from the bracelet tag to my phone screen where the open app announced, in no uncertain terms, a full moon. No. The words hopped out of Nassim's mouth, absurd and utterly inadequate. No, that's ridiculous. She's living with lycanthropy? Yes, I completed in a whisper. And she's on the cusp of an episode. What do we do? Nassim blinked again, face growing slack. A werewolf on a plane. The casual use of the slur was concerning enough, but the expression of blank incredulity made it so much worse. I knew right then and there that Nassim was not equipped to deal with the situation. She's right, I declared. We need to land. I'll stay here. Go tell the captain. You can't stay. None of us can stay. I could hear an edge of panic creeping up with every word. We have to. I grabbed my superior's arm tight enough to hurt and did my best to counter the stunned gaze with a show of determination. Go tell the captain. Once we land, we get everyone out, lock the plane, and call a trained expert. Nobody gets hurt, okay? Nassim nodded, much to my relief, before setting off chin up towards the front of the plane, smoothing imaginary wrinkles in the pristine flight attendant uniform. I stepped up to the door. I know speaking is difficult for you right now, so let's keep it simple. Can you do 1 knock for yes, 2 for no? There was a pause. Then she knocked once. Good. We're going to figure this out, all right? Silence. All right? I insisted. 1 knock, followed by a soft mewling. Have you hydrated in the last 4 hours? She knocked twice. I wasn't surprised. If she'd remembered to drink generously ahead of an episode, she would have remembered not to get on the plane in the first place. Can you manage the tap? I heard her shuffle around, then a messy splash of water. Finally a loud sigh. Better? A single weary knock. You're doing great. Remember to keep track of your breathing, yeah? In through the nose. 1, 2, 3, out through the mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do it with me now. I repeated the breathing pattern until I could hear her matching me. There we go, see? You're doing great. This, of course, led me to the difficult question. I'm sorry I have to ask, but are you on a lycosuppressant treatment? I did my best to mask my bluntness with a casual tone, but I knew she wasn't fooled. She understood better than most how much was riding on her answer. One knock. I held my breath, dreading a second. It didn't come. I exhaled in relief. I swallowed. That's really good. Suppressants meant physical restraints would be a last resort rather than a pressing plan B. It meant as long as we kept a cool head, we had a real chance of getting through it. My supervisor is notifying the captain. I'm sure they're already searching for the nearest landing strip. Nobody is going to get hurt. Do you understand? One knock. She moved in closer, her ragged breath heavy against the door. She moaned. We'll be okay. Everything will be okay. I'm still not sure who I was trying to convince. A few moments later, Nassim came back with a man I did not recognize. He introduced himself with a rank and a surname. I'm the Air Marshal, he declared, his clipped tone oozing self-importance. What's our status? I found his broad-chest bravado alarming from the onset, but I figured I could shift his attitude if I lead by example. She's experiencing the early symptoms of a lycanthropic episode, I explained, in as calm a voice as I could manage. Loss of speech, dehydration, severe paranoia, most likely the beginning of morphological shifts, show she's already turned, he summarized, most inaccurately. Right. His serious gaze shifted to Nassim. I got this. Do what you gotta do. Nassim nodded and looked at me. Come along now. I wanted to stay. Deep in my bones, I knew I shouldn't leave her. Especially not with someone like that man. I was familiar with the type. Talks a big game but acts the fool when push comes to shove. Not to mention he might be armed. That realization hit me like a punch. I found myself praying he didn't have a taser hidden somewhere in his person, and in retrospect, I regret that wish. I know it didn't ultimately impact the outcome, but my God, if only it had been a taser. She was in her prime. She could have taken the shock. It would have still been assault, still violence, but in that man's hands, a taser would have been a blessing, hell, a miracle. None of that mattered then. Not my worry, nor my intuition. A service job is a service job. Work that kind of gig long enough and following that old chain of command becomes second nature. I turned back to the door. Hey, listen, I have to go now, but I need you to keep drinking and breathing while I'm gone. Can you do that? She clawed at the door, whimpering, begging me not to abandon her. Hey, no, none of that, was the best I could manage. You've got this. You have to trust me, okay? I know she could hear the plea in my voice. Please, just say yes. Just try. She took a loud, gasping breath, then knocked once. I patted the door, whispered, "Atta girl," then turned back to Nassim and the marshal, meeting their dubious expression with a blank face. She takes medication, I declared. She's only dangerous if we make her. Don't you worry, the marshal replied. The situation is well under control. I'm sure, in his mind, he came across as confident. As I walked away, I watched him station himself opposite the door, arms crossed, staring down an imaginary foe. Nasim led me to the craft compartment, where Ayanda and Sam were waiting. The former staring at the floor, eyes vacant. The latter looking distinctly gray in the face. I surmised they'd been updated on the situation. "We're heading back to land," Nasim announced. "But it'll be at least an hour before we can let the passengers out. So in the meantime, we're evacuating. Coach to business, business to first." For a moment, I swear my brain just froze. I could not believe that was the plan. Sam whistled and said, "Nobody's gonna like that." I mean, talk about an understatement. They had no idea. Not one of them had the faintest clue what we were dealing with. "No," Nasim agreed gravely, "but we don't have a choice." "Of course we do," I interjected, my throat unexpectedly parched. "Tell the passengers we have to land due to a medical emergency and offer them a complimentary whatever. Doesn't matter. Keep them seated and keep them calm." Ayanda gasped at me. "Are you mad? What if it gets out?" It. Spoken in that clipped tone with that edge. How quickly personhood gets stripped away. "She's fine," I replied, regaining control of my voice. "An hour's nothing." I concentrated on Nasim. "I can keep her steady for that long. I know I can." Nasim's face didn't soften. "Absolutely not. We can't risk a stir," I hissed. "That's what we can't risk. If we treat her as dangerous, she will read that as being in danger." Sam scoffed. "She's dangerous no matter what." "The captain made the call," Nasim snapped, glaring at me. I knew that tone. Most of us do on instinct. The voice of a hierarchical logic demanding blind participation. "Okay," I conceded, helpless, my heart racing. "But at least let me go back to—" "You will do as you're told, and that's that," Nasim squeaked, eyes wide. The edge of panic from earlier was back in full force, bursting past the calm facade. It was there on all their faces, their features pinched against the onslaught. God, but they were terrified. Even more than that poor woman locked in the bathroom. And it didn't matter that her fear was, at a chemical level, infinitely more real than their foolish superstition. I knew she'd be able to keep her shit together far better than they would theirs. And if the crew lost control of the cabin, well, I had to make sure they did their job, which meant doing mine. So I shut my mouth and listened to my superior's orders. A few minutes later, Nasim's voice came chirping out of the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please." The passengers starved for an explanation perked up on cue. I'll give it to Nasim. The announcement of the evacuation was an impressive display of steel-clad nerves. The wording treaded a perfect line between calm and curt. Overwhelmingly polite, but projecting that unmistakable air of intransigence. "Please leave your belonging at your seat and make your way to the front of the plane. We thank you for your cooperation at this time." All the good stuff. Whatever else, Nasim was always a consummate professional. Nothing was said to connect the impromptu relocation to the drinking cart incident, but many of the passengers still eyed the back of the cabin. The marshal didn't even acknowledge their questioning looks, his attention still firmly planted on the bathroom door. I could tell from his tense posture that he felt those gazes on him, but he didn't even try to diffuse the tension. Amateur. "This is a mistake," Ayanda whispered, past a plastered smile, eyes betraying visceral terror. "She can hear this. She knows we're taking away her food." I couldn't believe my colleague, someone I'd considered a friend and a decent person in the most basic sense, could say something so vile. The horror of it was too much to contemplate in that moment, so I just gnashed my teeth and focused on the fact Ayanda had at least gotten her pronouns right this time. With the announcement over, we proceeded to repeating the same instructions all over again, at a more interpersonal level, now punctuated with practiced mime work. We did our best to stick to the role, but could feel the ambient tension rise. Amiable smiles only work so far. In the wrong light, they're little more than grimaces. Luckily, artificial authority works both ways. Even someone who's never been on a plane knows to create PA announcements as the word of God, and the gesturing flight attendants as anointed prophets. Dubious though they may have been, they got off their seats without asking too many questions. Someone at the front of the plane decided we should wait for business class to empty before letting the coach passengers through, which meant that, ironically, those who complied to our instructions fastest and got ready first were forced to stand around for a solid 15 minutes. We grinned through it, begging for their patience while constantly reiterating the term of the evacuation to those who insisted on offloading their carry-ons from the overhead compartments. As I worked, I kept darting glances toward the bathroom. The marshal never shifted from his post, his back up against the empty wall, always at a safe arm's length from the locked door. He kept rolling his shoulders and rearranging the flaps of his open jacket. I'd watched enough police procedurals to recognize that body language. He was wearing a shoulder holster. Imagining the possible implication made me literally sick. My heart beating into a twisted stomach, but I kept working, kept smiling. As I'd expected, by the time the last row of passengers were edging out of coach, we were already making our descent. The whole tense ordeal, and the effort it took for us to manage it, had been a complete waste. But at least, I figured, we were practically done. We were almost there. Then the other shoe dropped. Most descents are a breeze. Yes, sometimes we hit unexpected pressure pockets, but compensating for them is easy enough. That is, if the aircraft is properly balanced, which ours very much was not. Coach is by far the biggest compartment on any commercial flight, and we just emptied it into the front of the plane. So when it dipped between two layers of clouds, it dipped hard. The engines roared amidst a chorus of screams. Anything and anyone that wasn't fastened down went flying, myself included. My chest hit an armrest on my way back down, and I felt a distinct pop. As I landed in the middle of the aisle, a burning pressure blossomed in my ribs, choking down my breath. The pilot managed to steady the plane, but the screams persisted. One in particular stretched loud and true, coming from that locked bathroom. A scream which, in the sudden encroaching silence, turned into an all too familiar sound. That was the moment. The point of no return. Up to then, we'd had a chance. Slim and getting slimmer, but still a chance. If I had been by that door, I never would have let it get that bad. I would have gotten into that stall, even if it meant prying open the lock, and I would have hugged her, pressing my humanity right up against hers for as long as it took her to understand she was not alone. Her howl filled the plane, and for a moment it was beautiful. In most indigenous cultures, people who live with lycanthropy serve a crucial function in the social fabric. Colonial narratives often describe them as witch doctors or shaman, but such framings have a way of exotifying what are, in fact, far more practical responses to the condition. The way a friend of mine explained it, such individuals are valued for their unique sensibilities, their ability to discern the sort of unaddressed emotional current most folks ignore as a matter of habit. Every moon, this attuned person embodies the sum total of those undercurrents, serving as a sort of litmus test for the health of the community as a whole. To grossly oversimplify, it's a monthly vibe check. Among certain people, the role extends even further. Some claim that if given the opportunity to experience these hypersensibilities from a place of safety and nurture, the attuned is able to extend awareness beyond their fellow humans and commune with the land itself. I'm not sure if I'm ready to believe all that, but I can see the sense in it. Spiritual histories notwithstanding, the hyper-awareness itself is well documented. Multiple and protracted medical experiments, some of which, given the lack of basic ethics on display, clearly had no particular affection for their subjects, have reliably measured the phenomenon. Some academics have even gone so far as to identify it as the primary reason for the prevalence of anti-lycanthropy sentiments in modern societies. They argue that in any vertical hierarchy, the people at the top will invariably see the vibe check aspect as a threat to their position. After all, sweeping injustice under the rug is all but impossible if the misery of the exploited masses is made manifest on a monthly basis. So, for generations, whoever benefited from a power imbalance had a vested interest in spreading a counter-narrative, one in which the canary in the coal mine got repainted as an agent of violence. In an effort to correct this misrepresentation, activists have recently reclaimed lycanthropy as a rallying issue, casting those who experience episodes as truth-tellers, destined to lead the revolution. They've been known to howl en masse during protests. Parties more invested in a medicalized approach have condemned such practices as ableist and appropriative, though they themselves have been criticized for their over-reliance on market, i.e. profit-driven solutions. And on it goes. Language here is important. The W word isn't just another descriptor. Its very etymology betrays a deliberate dehumanizing intent. By design, it conjures up images of fur-covered bipedal hybrids, animated by a singular urge to sink claws and fangs into flesh, when the reality of it, while admittedly somewhat lupine-looking if one squints, isn't nearly that impressive. Most of it is just swelling. Body hair, wherever it should occur, stands on end. The sinuses and throat open up, forcing the surrounding bone and sinew to jet outwards. The ribcage expands to give the lungs extra room, and massive amounts of oxygen get pumped into the muscles. Due to the negative propaganda, most folks assume these are signs of a body preparing for a rampage, which couldn't be farther from the truth. Every morphological change that occurs during episodes is consistent with the facilitation of a singular goal: to escape. The marshal pulled out his gun. "Freeze!" he yelled. The evacuation had resulted in a powder keg of tension, and the turbulent descent supplied the fuse. The indication of a firearm was the spark. Panic exploded. I heard it behind me, the crashing of bodies as the passengers jostled and scrambled for safety, the gasps and snarls and squeals, everyone for themselves. I saw it in front of me, the walls of the bathroom stall shaking as she thrashed and wailed, unable to contain the sudden onslaught of raw, visceral, unfiltered terror. The marshal's paper-thin confidence cracked. "Get back!" he barked. "Now, I will shoot!" She responded in kind. Tit for tat. Intimidation for intimidation. A last-ditch effort to communicate in his chosen language. She belted out a bone-chilling roar. Fight or flight. It doesn't really happen in a split second. In different circumstances, he might have gone for the latter. He did back off, reflexively, unsteadily, the first step of what could have well been turned into a scrambled escape. But he was holding a gun, finger on the trigger, safety off. He was already locked on fight. Pa! Pa! The gunshots sliced through the chaos, sharp as an open-handed slap, aimed straight at that minuscule stall like shooting fish in a barrel. Her roar twisted into a wounded yelp, my breath caught. She burst out of the bathroom. The door flew clean off its hinges, slamming the marshal against the opposite stall. He crumpled like a rag doll. And there she was. Hirsute, hunched, seething, clothes torn at the seams, blood gushing from a chest wound, crimson down her stomach, down her legs dripping on the floor. I realized I was screaming, begging, pleading, "Stop, just stop." Her eyes spun, jaw slack, swollen face streaked with tears. She looked down the aisle to find pure terror, a stampeding, trampling mass of it. The stupid fools thought she was looking at them, but she only wanted a way out. She was standing at the end of a steel tube next to the man who had just shot her. Where else was she going to go? She came barreling down the aisle and leapt over me without missing a step. The writhing mass of passengers parted before her. Those who were too slow, she either circumvented or shoved aside. For reasons I still can't fathom, Nassim decided to bar her way. Made a pretty good show of it, too. Arms spread out, head held high, face set in a look of righteous determination. The woman actually had to skid to a halt, if only to redirect her momentum. The brief halt is, supposedly, what prompted the marshal to open fire again. He had, according to some experts, been trained to take advantage of stationary targets, so that's what he did. A thin argument considering he was firing directly into a crowd of bystanders. Very much not a part of his training. Besides, the why of it isn't all that relevant. What matters, at least, to me, is that the woman ducked, and Nassim did not. Crimson exploded against the pastel blue of the flight attendant uniform. I whirled back to the marshal, found him half slumped under the lavatory sign, one arm dangling from his shoulder at an odd angle, the other brandished unsteadily, a shaky fist wrapped around that absurd and deadly penis substitute. She cut sideways, fleeing the exposed aisle, and the idiot just kept on firing, bleeding like a frustrated child as he kept missing her. Pa, pa, pa. The muzzle flashes bright in the flickering lights of the once again careening plane. She really tried. Say what you will, but nobody can deny she did her goddamn utmost, weaving and dodging, even drawing his fire away from the passengers. But he just wouldn't stop. So she doubled back to address the pressing threat he posed to everyone in the plane. Again, what else was she supposed to do? He went right on pressing that trigger even as she tackled him to the ground. One of the last bullets he fired ricocheted somewhere behind me. I felt a sharp pain in my lower back and collapsed. The marshal's scream changed in pitch, from a raging howl to a squeal of agony. His arm landed with a wet flop in the middle of the aisle. A limp finger still caught the trigger guard. I'll admit, tearing his arm off wasn't the most elegant solution, but it got the job done. The bullet stopped. She scrambled away from the marshal and spun, ready to resume her escape. I screamed, summoning every shred of strength I had left. Look at me! She did. She saw the growing puddle of blood around my limp legs, the way I was hugging my aching ribs, reaching out for her with my eyes, my voice, my everything, dragging myself, however unsuccessfully, not away, but toward her. Lycanthropy-affected faces are hard to read, but I swear I saw it. A subtle shift of focus, from ambient fear to ambient pain. By then, there was more than enough of the latter to tip the balance. I held her horrified gaze and forced myself to smile. Hey, I managed weakly, my voice shattered. I extended an open hand. Come here. She approached me tentatively. Low to the floor, confused nasal whines escaping her drooling mouth. Everything faded away. The plane, the passenger, even her haunting appearance. All I saw were her eyes, coming back to me again and again until she was close enough that I could see myself in them. I found purchase on the curve of her shoulder and pulled myself up. My body protested, what little of it I could still feel, but I didn't care. I couldn't. I was finally hugging her. Stay with me, I whispered. The last thing I remember from that day is the tenderness with which she scooped me up from the floor and carried me onto a nearby seat. The way she cradled me, cooing softly into my ear until I drifted to black. That's how they found us, cuddled up together on the cramped bench. By then, she too was unconscious. Even an adrenaline-addled brain needs a healthy flow of blood to function, and a whole bunch of hers was splattered all over the cabin. They still shot her full of tranquilizers, just to be safe. It's a miracle she survived. Others weren't so fortunate. 12, to be exact. 3 were done in by blunt force trauma, either during the plane dive or in the subsequent stampede. All 3 made it out of the plane alive, only to circle the drain in the following hours. Internal bleeding is a bitch. 2 suffocated when bodies started piling up, crushed under the weight of fear, gasping for air but unable to draw breath. 1 was a 9-year-old child who, according to the parents, loved unicorns and monster trucks. The other was a 27-year-old flight attendant named Ayanda, who may have had some deplorable beliefs, but still deserved better. 6 were killed by bullets. Ironically, of those 6, Nassim took the longest to die, making it all the way past the operating room and into the ICU, a spectacular overachiever to the very last. On the opposite end of that spectrum was Sam, whose death was instantaneous. Clean headshot, in at the base of the skull, out just above the brow ridge. The 12th casualty was the marshal. He managed to lock himself in the bathroom stall that still had a door, then swiftly fainted from blood loss. He was dead by the time first responders thought to check the lavatories. Of all the charges that were laid at the woman's feet in the ensuing trial, his death was the one that stuck. Aggravated manslaughter. Her lawyer went all out on a self-defense argument, spending a solid hour on ballistics mapping to show how every single one of the bullets the marshal fired hit at least one human body. It was a bold move to cast her as a surprise anti-hero whose gruesome actions had saved lives, actually. Perhaps too bold, given the prevailing mood. Elsewhere, in a different trial, the survivors, the victims, and their families were suing a multinational corporation and a whole security apparatus for massive damages. Big money and big power were going out of their way to claim that despite a few systematic blind spots, the whole mess was still mostly her fault, because she, and she alone, had decided to bring her monstrosity onto that plane. I wish their campaign hadn't been so effective. If not for her, then for myself. As a beneficiary of that lawsuit, I could have received a better pension. I first visited her in prison as an assignment from my psychologist. Spending time with her could, in theory, help me contextualize, and therefore manage some of my post-traumatic symptoms. Within a few minutes, she complimented my wheelchair. She was especially drawn to the practicality of having so many pouches and pockets always at hand. I explained those attachments were actually grueling to find on the market, to the point I'd ended up teaching myself to sew so I could make them for myself. She was appalled, but not surprised. She marveled at my cross-stitching. I go see her once a month, during new moons. It was her idea. That way, she says, I get to see her at her best, at her most rested and grateful. We don't talk about full moons. I've been trying to find out what they do with her, but the prison administration is being cagey. My guess is solitary confinement, which isn't ideal, but could be worse. At least they leave her be. She talks about her children a lot and brings pictures of them at every visitation. She hasn't received any new snapshots in a while, but she doesn't let it bother her. She doesn't even mind that her little ones are posing with strangers who are raising them. She just beams at their faces. She tells me she looks forward to introducing me. I know the likelihood of that happening at this point is microscopic. And I know she knows it too. I tell her I can't wait.
Codì Audeguy-Pegon is at our happiest when exploring the farthest reaches of the imaginary, where the mundane waltzes with the impossible and the only limit is cohesive world building. Born and raised at the foot of the Alps, Codì emigrated to South Africa in her late teens. The story was written in Cape Town, where he is grateful to live and work. Gabe Hicks is a game designer for digital and tabletop. He created the CMM, an alternative character creation tool for D&D 5e focused on class narrative that has been featured on the D&D Twitch channel. He's also worked with Paizo, Critical Role, Mage Hand Press, and Grim and Perilous Studios. Leading a group called Mythic Grove, he focuses on highlighting smaller creators to give them a platform and opportunity through streaming, design, writing, or other creative mediums with the projects that Mythic Grove creates. Along with designing games, Gabe is a voice actor and a cosplayer. You can find him on Instagram and Twitter at Gabe James Games. The music tracks featured in this episode were arranged by myself, and you can find more of my work at youseethehat.bandcamp.com. The theme music for Apex Magazine podcast was written and produced by Alex White. If you enjoyed this podcast, visit apex-magazine.com for more strange and beautiful fiction by Codì Audeguy-Pegon and many others. Our genre magazine also includes interviews with authors and artists, fiction reviews, and nonfiction by some of the leading voices in the business. Subscriptions are $27 annually. That's apex-magazine.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.